All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. So, Baruch Hashem, begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev. To thank Josh and Becca Friedman for dedicating the Shiurim and Drashos this month. Leilui Nishmas, Josh, his father, Yisrael Yehuda, Ben Rav Chaim Rafal Zichron Livracha. To thank Sammy and Malka Esterson for dedicating the Shiurim and Drashos this month. In memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim, and in the schus of the continued health and tatzlacha of Mr. Morton Esterson Admeh Ve'esem Shanim Tovos. To thank the Pepper family for dedicating all the Shumer Drushos this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Yosef Pepper, Yosef David Zichron Livracha ben Yaakov. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Steve Galaskov, in honor of his father's first yahrzeit. In Hashem of Nachum Sender ben Meshulam, Shalom Yirtz Hashem have an aliyah and enjoy an eternal licht Gan Eden. We thank Ayala and Sarah Steimer for dedicating the Week of Learning and the schus of Refuah Shleima for the continued help of Shulamis Bas Susha. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, the Ephron family, in honor of our Zaidi, great Zaidi, and great Zaidi, Yosef Herschel ben Mordechai Halevi, Jerome Ephron, on the occasion of his 99th birthday. Wow. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. Incredible. I will say I have a strong feeling that also once you reach 99, the only kind of gift that actually matters to you is Torah. Because at the age of 99, anything else and of course your family, I'm saying anything else that's going to be gashmi, anything else that's going to be material, I can't imagine holds that much weight for you anymore. So beautiful. And of course, again, our Daf Yomi refreshments are sponsored by Gidai Rosenblum in commemoration of the yahrzeit of his mother, Rachel Bas Meir, Zichron Livracha. We hope that the merit of the brachas of the Talmud Torah, Mir Tashem, the Neshama Shtav and Aliyah, and the family in Nechama. All right, Jabose, with that, beautiful to see so many sponsorships, truly heartwarming. So I'll say with that, let us begin. So we are picking up today, Mir Hashem, on Daf Mem Zayin. We're actually picking up on the top of the page. 2 dots. Ha'omer L'Chavero. So I'll say, so just to reorient ourselves a little bit, this was the last case in the Mishnah. So in this case in the Mishnah, a person selected. So Omer L'Chavero, Konem Lebeischa Sha'ani Nichnas. Right, so this is a case where I go over to Ruvain, I say to Ruvain, your home is konam onto me, for me to enter it. Remember again about say, konam, ultimately again is a kinui, is a similar equivalent expression. Konam means carbon. So effectively I'm going ahead and top of the page Mem Zayin, 47a. Right? So essentially what I'm saying is your home is a carbon to me, entering into it. So what's the halacha? Or again, sadcha shani lokeach, or again your field is konam to me in terms of purchasing it. So what's the halacha? The halacha is ultimately again meis o shemachru la'achar mutar. If Reuven sells the field, right, or he dies, I'm permitted to go ahead and now enter the house or purchase the field. What's the logic? The logic is because it's no longer Reuven's. The prohibition only was there when it actually belonged to Reuven. Similarly, again, kones bayis shani nichnas. Konem bayis zeh shani nichnas. Sada zu shani lokeach. Meis o shemachru la'achar asar. However, again, most of you've actually seen this already before. If I say this home or this field should be konam to me, then what? Then even if halacha l'maisa, Ruvain dies, I still can't go into the house, I still can't purchase the field. Good. So I'll say that was the case in the Mishnah, and the truth is we actually saw it before in earlier sugyos as well. Based on this, something really interesting occurs. Boy Avimi. So Avimi raised the kasha. What was Avimi's kasha? Konem lebayis zeh sha'ato nichnas. So we'll say now this is the reverse case. In this case over here, I go and I say to Ruvain, konem lebayis zeh sha'ato nichnas. Ruvain, my home, this home, or actually, I'm not really saying my home, I'm saying this home. Ruvain, this home should be konam to you in that you cannot enter. So I'm making this home, which is my home, making this home my home, konam onto Ruvain. So what's the halacha? Meis, oshemachro la'acher, mahu. So we'll say, what's the halacha? If let's say I die, or I go ahead and I sell it to someone else, is Ruvain, what's Ruvain's status? What's his relationship ultimately, again, with this piece of property? I'm supposed to take a quick look at the Ran for just a moment. So the Ran is in the wide lines 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines in. Middle of the line where it says Konam. Konam abai zeh shani nichnas v'sada zeh shani lokeach meisu machal ha'achar aser techevan de bayis zeh ka'amar shavye iluye chaticha disura. So here's the shaila. So I go ahead, I have a home, we should actually do this outside. I have a home and I say to Ruvain, Konam bayis zeh sha'ata nichnas. This home is konam onto you for your entering into it. Which Rabbi essentially means what? What am I doing? I'm telling Ruvain, he cannot enter the home. What's the shaila? I die, or I go ahead and I sell it. What's the halacha? Does the prohibition to enter the home still remain upon Ruvain or not? So we'll say, what's the shaila? So here we go. Adam oser davar shir b'shuso lichashiyetze mirshuso olo. So we'll say, does a person have the ability to essentially create a level of isser on an item that's in his possession, to the point that the item remains prohibited even when it leaves his possession. So I will say, that's the shayla. In other words, obviously, when the house is mine, am I allowed to say to Ruvain, Konam bayis ze alecha? Can I say that? Absolutely. Why? It's mine. So what's the shayla? Can I create a level of prohibition, or can I create an isser that will remain on the object even when it's not in my possession? And I will say, when you look at this question, it's strange. What's the havamina that should work? I will say, where would I even think for a moment that I could go ahead and regulate the status of something when it's no longer under my control? So what's right? If you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. In other words, when I own the home, to say Ruvain, it's konam onto you, that's fine. Now I take the home, I sell it to Levi. The home has nothing to do with me anymore. Why would there be a havamina that therefore Ruvain can't enter into the house? So we'll say, I'm telling you this now, though we're going to see it later on, but I think it's important piece to understand the sugya. And all of this derives, or this havamina derives from the following case. Let's say I say to my son, doesn't mean my son, but this is the case in the Gemara. Right? I say to my son, my property is konam onto you during my life and after my death. What's the halacha? My son can't benefit from my property during my lifetime and after my death. That's the springboard for this conversation. Once you have a concept that you can legislate the status of your estate even after your death, and again, that we're going to see everyone agrees with. Everyone agrees you could legislate the status of your estate after your death. That wasn't good English, but you could legislate during your lifetime, right? What's going to happen to your estate after your death? We'll say, what does that show that you can do? That shows that there's a concept of being able to legislate status even when something is no longer technically under your purview. Once I accept that premise, then this havamina becomes possible. So now I'm asking, so I say to Ruvain, this home is konam onto you. This home is konam onto you. Now the home changes possession. Does the prohibition still devolve upon Ruvain? So I'll say, but the formulation is very interesting. Now, Adam oser davar shebershuso lichishiyetze lershuso. Does a person have, let me say differently, does a person have the ability to create a level of isser while an item is under his ownership to the point that the level of isser will remain intact even when what? It's no longer under his ownership or not? That's the shaila. So Rabbi says, Tashma, so here it is. Homer libno, a person says to his son, Konem shi'atananeli umeis irashenu. If I say to my son, Konam my property onto you, or Konam my hana onto you, which means I'm making a neder that my son should not derive any benefit from me. So what's the halacha? The halacha is when I'm alive, the neder is intact. If I die, the neder is no longer intact. My son has the ability to go ahead and inherit me. On the other hand, again, the Hagos changes to Bechayai ubemosi. What happens if I say to my son, Konam my hana onto you during my lifetime and during my death? Oh, then in that case, umeis, and then I die, lo yirashenu. We'll say ultimately again, he doesn't inherit me. What do you see from here? Shma mina, Adam oser davar shebershuso lichishiyetze mershuso shma mina. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, a person indeed does have the ability to legislate the status of property that he currently owns and allowed that status to remain even after he no longer owns it. So Rabbi says, so that's what I pointed out. The paradigmatic case, or the source case for this, is the case of the father and son, right? Father says to his son, Kona my property onto you, or Kona hana, my hana onto you, during my lifetime and during my death. What's the halacha? During the lifetime of the father, son can't benefit, and after the father dies, the son does not inherit him, which shows us that a person is able to create a level of Isser upon property that he currently owns, and if he articulates it in a certain way, that level of Isser could remain even after he no longer owns the property. And I will say that's how the Rambam paskins. The Rambam says over here in Parak Hey, Halacha Hey of Hilchos Nedarim. Actually, no, maybe we'll save it. Yeah, you know what? Let's actually. I'll come back to this halacha. Let's do actually the next case first. I will say, but again, that is how the Gemara is paskining. Adam oser davar shebershuso. A person can prohibit something when it's in his property, when it's in his rishus. And the level of Isser will remain even when the item leaves his Rosh. So I will say, if you think about it, it's a pretty significant Chiddush. That you could regulate. I will say, it's also like such a, you could regulate the status of an item even if you no longer own it. I will say, there's an incredible Musar Haskel in that as well, which is sometimes actions that we perform, actions we engage in, things we say, have a ripple effect long after those things are in my reshus, right? You say something to someone, the word has right. So when my words are in my reshus, I go ahead and I control them, right? So now I said the words have left my reshus, left my reshus. So you might think that the words leave your reshus. That's it. You no longer control their impact. So I will say it's not true. Sometimes the impact I create, even once the words leave my reshus, are still there. Same thing with maisim. So many times we act, we do things, and we fail to recognize that the consequences of our actions live on long after those actions have left our domain. What I do, what I say, how I act has a ripple effect that often remains intact long after I've even forgotten about the words or forgotten about the actions. What a musar. Let's go back there. So it's not Hasam. Let's say another Mishnah. Konam peros ha'elu alai. So listen to this. Person says, Konam these peros onto me. Okay, so we'll say it's a pretty straightforward case, right? So konam, these fruit should be a konam to me. What am I saying? I'm prohibiting myself from deriving any benefit from these fruit. Or konam hein al pi, right? Or I say these fruits should be konam to my mouth. Konam hein lifi, right? Ultimately, again, these fruits should be konam to my mouth. So good. Both say all straight out lashonos, ultimately again of an Isser Neder. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? This is very interesting. Aser b'chilufein u'b'gidulehen. Wow, this is really interesting. So we'll say, let's work backwards. If you take those fruit, right? So I have a bushel of apples, right? The basket of apples. I say these apples are konam lepi. I'm not allowed to eat them. Okay. Now, both say, imagine I go ahead and I plant those apples, and now a new apple tree grows from it. What's the halacha? I can't benefit from the apple tree. Can't benefit from it. Why not? Because that's called gidulehen. So both say that's not the bigger chiddush. What's the bigger chiddush? The bigger chiddush is chilufehen. Both say if you take a look at Rashi for just a moment. So Rashi says over here, what does it mean chilufehen? So first of all, go out of order. Rashi says gidulehen is shenatan v'igdil. That's what I just told you. Take the apples, you plant it. So both say that makes sense, right? Why does that make sense? Because lamaisa, if I take the apples, plant them, and now an apple tree grows, that apple tree is a derivative of, is it not even a derivative? It's a direct manifestation of the apples which I prohibited to myself, therefore it's aser. But look at Rashi, aser b'chilufein, first short line, in this chalfu b'peiros acheros, v'davar shalab ali olamu. And we'll say, watch this. Let's say I have a basket of apples. I say these apples are konam to my mouth, so I'm not allowed to eat them. And now what happens, I take the basket of apples, I exchange them for a basket of oranges, right? Or I exchange them for money. What's the halacha, says the Gemara? I'm not allowed to benefit from the oranges, I'm not allowed to benefit from the money. Right? Ulta, it's chilufein. Any item that I exchange the apples for, ultimately, again, is prohibited under the power of the neder. Incredible. So the Gemara says, now here's fine. So that's the straightforward halacha of the Gemara. Now the Gemara says, listen to this. By Rami Bar Chama, Amar konam peros ha'ilu al ploni. This is very interesting. Let's say I have a basket of apples, and I say, my apples should be konam to Ruvain. Should be konam to Ruvain. Okay? So we'll say, so now what's the shaila? So mahu b'chilufeihen. So we'll say, so here's what's interesting. The Gemara doesn't ask about gidulehen because gidulehen is obvious, right? If I go ahead and I say, Ruvain, this basket of apples is usher unto you, then I plant a basket of apples and it causes an apple tree. It makes sense that apple tree is going to be usher to Ruvain. Why? Because the apple tree is just simply another form of the same exact apples that I prohibited. What about the exchange? I was supposed to say, so let's say I have a basket of apples. I say, Ruvain, these apples are konam to you. These apples are konam to you. And now what happens? Now I exchange the basket of apples for a basket of oranges. Are the oranges usher to Ruvain or not? It's the shaila. So the Gemara says, so let's analyze this. Mi amrinan gabi delay hoil va'adam oser peros chavera latzmo oser davar shelo bali olam. Now both say, let's take a step back for just a moment. Remember again, Rashi said, what's the interesting part about chilufeihen, Rabbi? What's the interesting part of it? Rashi calls chilufeihen a davar shelo bali olam. What's a davar shelo bali olam? Something that was not in existence at the time the neder was made. So this is very interesting, right? Because think about this. Let's go back to the original case. I said, konam this basket of apples for me. So say, now what happens? I exchanged the basket of apples for a basket of oranges. As far as the neder was concerned, did I have in mind the basket of oranges when I went ahead and I spoke about the apples? Bepashtus, no. So Rashi calls this a davar shelo bali olam. This was not in existence. So the oranges might have actually been physically in existence. What he means is in terms of my mindset, right? The oranges were not in existence. We're not in existence at the time I made the neder. So what we see is something very interesting. Yet, when it comes to my own neder prohibits gidulehen, which is obvious, but also prohibits chilufeihen. Also prohibits a davar shelo bali olam. Okay, so now we're asking this follow-up question. What's the following question? I make the neder, Ruvain, konam, this basket of apples to you. You can't get benefit from the apples. So the Gemara takes it for granted that gidulehen is going to be usher. Okay, what about chilufeihen? Now I go ahead and I take the basket of apples, and I exchange it ultimately again for a basket of oranges. Thank you. So what's the shaila? So here we go. Mi amrinan gabe delay. When it comes to the person himself, meaning me. When it comes to I'm the one who made it. When it comes to me, hoil va'adam oser peros chavera alatzmo. As an individual, I have the ability to prohibit my friend's produce to myself. Therefore, oser davar shelo bali olam alatzmo. I could also aser a davar shelo bali olam, something that was not yet in existence at the time of my neder upon myself. So what the Gemara is saying is like this. The same way I could take something external to me and make it aser to me, so I could also make a davar shelo bali olam aser upon myself as well. Right? In other words, so I could go ahead and I could say Ruvain's produce is aser to me. So to a davar shelo bali olam as well. The basket of oranges, which I didn't have in mind at the time of the neder, also becomes aser to me. On the other hand, gabi chavero, Adam ose peros chavero al chavero. So on the other hand, when it comes to my friend Ruvain, right, I can't aser Ruvain's fruit upon Ruvain. Right? In general, this is a general halacha. But I will say, you know where we know this from? The paradigmatic example of this is avodah zarah. The halacha is if you go ahead and you worship someone's item, chas v'shalom, as avodah zarah, you can't transform that item into avodah zarah. So can you imagine, by the way, you get into a fight with your neighbor, right? He rolls up in his brand new car, and you say, watch this, right? You take out your prayer rug, you go ahead, you bow down to the car, right? Make the car into avodah zarah. Say, well, you say to yourself, but that's also an isser misa. You'd be surprised what people would be willing to do to get back into friends. Right? So we'll say, or former friends. Right? So can you imagine? So the halacha is you cannot go ahead and transform, even if you worship someone else's item as avodah zarah, you can't transform it into a deity, in form of idolatry. So Rabbi say this concept of Adam, right? You cannot aser your friend's peiros upon your friend. You can't aser anything upon your friend. I take that back. you can ask her something. That's all of these cases. I'm asking you something. In other words, I can't take Ruvain's produce and make Ruvain's produce asur onto him. Therefore, we'll say the same way, perhaps, that I can't go ahead and take Ruvain's produce and make Ruvain's produce asur onto him. So too, ein adam oser davar shala bali olam al chavero. Maybe I also can't make a davar shala bali olam asur upon my friend. See, I will say, what can I do? See, I can take my bushel of apples, and make a neder, and through that neder, prohibit the bushel of apples on Ruvain. That I can do. But maybe if I go ahead and I exchange those apples for oranges, the neder doesn't devolve upon the oranges. Why not? Because the oranges are a davar shalab ali olam, and in the same way that I can't take Ruvain's produce and make it asr upon Ruvain, maybe I also can't take a davar shalab ali olam and make it asr upon Ruvain as well. Oh, Dilma, Amud Bezer will say, oh, the other possibility is, oh, Dilma, Mishum dechilufan ki gidulan dami, lo shnohu v'lo shna chavero. Or I'll say, maybe not. Maybe chilufeyan and gidulehen are kind of like a unit. And that's why they're mentioned together. And therefore, wherever gidulein is going to be problematic, so too again, so chilufein is going to be the same thing. And therefore, there's just same way that ultimately they will say, if I make an neder for myself, right? I make it, I'm not eating a basket of apples. So gidulein, if I plant the apples and they grow a tree, can't eat it. Chilufein, exchange the apples, still can't eat the basket of oranges. So too again, the semi chilufein and gidulein works by me. Chilufein and gidulein is a unit. So too by Ruvain, gidulein works. So therefore, chilufein will also be asar. So we'll say that's the shaila. So again, let's just frame this. So here's what it seems like everybody agrees with. If I make a neder, and I say this basket of apples is asar to me. If I plant the apples and it grows a tree, what's the halacha? Still asar. If I exchange the basket of apples for a basket of oranges, still asar. This is for me, right? Everyone agrees with that. The shaila is, I make a neder now prohibiting my basket of apples to Ruvain. So everyone's going to agree that halacha lamaisa gidulein, if you take those apples, plant it, it grows a tree, it's still going to be asar to Ruvain. This shaila is chilufeihan. If you exchange the apples for a basket of oranges, what is the status of that basket of oranges for Ruvain? So we have two possibilities. Working backwards, we say, listen, maybe chilufein and gidulein is just a unit. And if gidulein is prohibited, chilufein is prohibited, in that case, it would be asar Ruvain as well. On the other hand, maybe not. Maybe the reason ultimately, again, why chilufein works, chilufein is a davar shalab ali olam. The same way by myself, I could asar my friend's produce onto myself. Therefore, I could also asar a davar shalab ali olam. But by my friend, I can't asr my friend's produce onto himself. Maybe I can't asr a davar shalab ali olam as well. So that's the shaila. So here the Gemara says, so let's answer it up. Amr Rav Acha bar min Yomi, Tashma, Homer leishto. Suppose there's an interesting case. Homer leishto, konam she'eni nana lech. So we'll say, this is actually very interesting. Now, if you take a look, actually take a look at that Gos Vitziyunim. We'll say, you see it, it's on the bottom left, just when you thought the print could not get any smaller, it actually does. So as I said, now listen to this. So he just changes the girsa here. The girsa says, Perish lav ma'ashani nana mimech kamer ella hanaasi lach. Okay, what this is a case of us is as follows. A man says to his wife, right, konam my hana'a to you. Konam my hana'a to you. So essentially what he's doing is he's saying to his wife that she is prohibited to get any hana from him. That's the case, right? They're going to be in Dr. Solomon's or Dr. Kropkin's office very soon, right after making this statement, right? So I'll say, so ultimately again, so go ahead, right? So konam, ultimately again, you're not getting any hana from me. Okay, now we'll say, now what's the problem with this? There are many problems with this, right? They'll say, but one of the problems is the wife has a right to mizonos, right? And therefore, halacha l'maisa, again, how is she getting mizonos? So watch this. It's actually very interesting. So the Gemara says, lova u'ubale chovin ban v'nefrain. So we'll say, what could she do? She could borrow money to go ahead and pay for mizonos. And I will say, what happens? The creditors go to the husband for repayment. Now I will say, now this is very interesting. What's the problem? If she's borrowing money and the husband is paying the debt, Rabbi say, what is she getting? What is she getting? Hana. Isn't that in violation of the neder? Rather, it must be what? This is incredible. My time about Ifran. This is so interesting. So why is it that the creditors have the ability to collect money from the husband? If at the end of the day, wouldn't that be a violation of the neder? In other words, isn't the wife going ahead and getting hana from the husband? It must be mishum chilufin lav kigidulin dami. It will say it must be that what? Listen to this. You see, when the wife borrows money to get mazonos, and then gets mazonos, and then the creditors go ahead and come to get repayments from the husband, see, Rabbi say that's chilufein, right? Remember, the hana that she received was the money she got from the creditor. The money that the husband's paying back is something different. So it's an exchange. It's an exchange. So you see from here that when you make a neder prohibiting someone to get hana from you, the neder really only devolves upon the primary object, not any exchange for the object. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, the repayment of the debt is effectively considered to be chilufein in exchange, and therefore, ultimately, again, it should be permitted. Quite interesting. To which the Gemara says, Amar Rava, maybe not. Delo vi So what's very interesting? Maybe the Gemara says, maybe not. Maybe in reality, this process should not be done. But if it was done, it works. Meaning what? We'll say, take a look at the Ran. First wide line in the Ran. First wide line. V'dilma l'chatchilahu delo v'avid kilomar kishubala hachlif iser behetra l'chatchila biadayim aser v'echlifan asurin avazu b'shah shalafsa alfa pisha bal nischayev ein kan chalife iser mamish hilchach yicholihi lelavos v'lecha v'afa bisha achakach nifroim min abal di'avid hu she'asu chalibin l'masha achla. Shabbos said it's very interesting. But the way the Ran understands, Shabbos say, Pasha Pshat is how you understand the statement of the Gemara. What the Gemara is saying is ideally, Chilufin is Asar. But B'diavad, if you did it, you did it. The Ran is explaining a little bit differently. The Ran is saying this case of the woman is not really a case of Chilufin. I will say, what's the case of Chilufin? What's the case of Chilufin? What's the case? Where there is a direct exchange. Right? I have a basket of apples, right? I have a basket of apples, and I directly exchange that basket of apples, not for a basket of oranges. That's where the Gemara says, if I made the neder, I'm not getting hana from the basket of apples, right? Ultimately, again, and I exchange it for a basket of oranges, chilufein asurin, a direct exchange. The Gemara suggests this is not a case of a direct exchange, right? We'll say, right? This is not a case of direct exchange. What's happening over here? Husband made a neder, wife can't get hana from me. What does she do? She goes out, she borrows money, she gets mazonos, creditors come back for a bit. This is not a case of direct exchange. So because it's not a case of direct exchange, therefore halacha l'maisa is going to be mutter. But maybe, what the Ran is saying is maybe in a case of direct exchange, it would be usher. It would be usher even for someone else. It would be usher. So the Gemara goes, the Gemara says, Ella tashma. So we're still trying to resolve our question. Again, just want to be clear. We're hyper-focused on one case here. What's the one case? I have a basket of apples. I say, Ruvain, konam this basket of apples to you. So we'll say, so what's our shaila? I exchanged the basket of apples for a basket of oranges. Now my shaila is the basket of oranges usher to Ruvain or not? That's our shaila. So we tried to prove it by the case of the Isha. The Gemara says it's not a good case. Why? That's not a real case of chilufeyan. That's not a direct exchange. It's a very indirect exchange. So watch this. Ella, Tashma, listen to this. Hamikadesh ba'arla ina mikudeshes. Supposed to listen to this. A man is mekadesh his wife with arla. So we'll say, so listen to this. So Ruvain goes over to Rachel. We'll say, what's arla? Arla is fruit of the first 3 years, right? You plant a tree, right? First 3 years, the fruit is arla. So Ruvain shows up, right? Ruvain shows up at Rachel's doorstep with a beautiful bushel of apples. Only one problem, it's arla. They will say, what's the problem with arla? Arla is asarbana. You can't get benefit from arla. Right? So obviously, again, in order for any kind of item, right, or financial instrument to be usable for kiddushin, it has to be mutar ba'anash. A woman has to be able to get benefit from it. So she can't get benefit from the arla. So we'll say, so now watch this. Now watch this. Machran v'kiddush b'dimeyan harizu mikudeshas. But we'll say, if he sells the arla and ultimately, again, uses the money to affect kiddushin, ultimately, again, it works. It works. Now, I'll say, what does that show you? What does that show you? That chilufeihen, the exchange of an item, does not have the status of the original item. Take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi says, we'll say in the second white line in Rashi, left-hand side, Machar v'kiddush v'demei mekudeshes. Alma the chalifin lav ki gidulin dami. The gidulin asra b'chlei mishter. So watch this. So if Reuven shows up with a basket of arla to his kala, hariat mikudeshes li ba'arla zu, and what does she do? Slams the door in his face. Get a job, right? Get a job. Bring me something real for kiddushin. Come on, get it together, right? So I will say, I don't mean to project, right? I will say, but Lamai says. So what happens now? He goes there. He sells the arla. Comes back with a bag of money, gives her the money, and she's mikudeshes. It works. Really? So fascinating. What does that show you? That chilufeihen lav kigidulin, right? That ultimately the exchange of something prohibited has a permitted status. Does not. In other words, when you exchange a prohibited item for something else, the prohibited status does not devolve upon the secondary item. V'haraya, the money of the arla is able to affect kiddushin. So I will say, using this logic again, plugging this back in, what will we say? I say to Ruvain, this basket of apples should be usher to you. Konam, this basket of apples to you. And now exchange the basket of apples for a basket of oranges. What should be the status of the oranges? Mutter, right? Mutter. Why? Because what have we just shown? That the exchange does not take on the status of the original item. Just like when you sell the arla, the money becomes permitted, so too the oranges should be permitted as well. To which the Gemara says, no. I will say, again, what the Gemara is saying is like this. When the Gemara says it works, what does it mean it works? It works b'diavad, right? The avid. In other words, I will say, no one's going to say that really l'chatchila you should sell arla and go ahead and use the proceeds of that sale for kiddushin, right? L'chatchila, one should not do it. Why? Because l'chatchila, we say chilufeihen is kigidulehen, right? Ultimately, again, the exchange of a prohibited item takes on the same status as the original prohibited item. It's just b'diavad. If you did it, it works. The avid. If you did it, ultimately, again, it'll work. Good. So we'll say. So let's close this out. So now, the way this. So we'll say the sugya doesn't really seem to end in a totally definitive way. So let's analyze this a little bit. So let's see, what is the halacha l'maaseh? So we'll say, so essentially what we have is really two questions, right? Two questions. Ultimately, question number one. So actually, let's work backwards. So we'll say, how do we pass in this last case? So again, here's what I know. I make a neder to go that this basket of fruit should be konam to me. So we'll say, if I take the fruit, I take the basket of apples and I plant them and make a new apple orchard, what's the halacha? Aser. What do we call that? Giduleid. Excellent. If I take the basket of apples and I exchange for a basket of oranges, what's the halacha? Aser. Why? On me. Aser, why? Chilufeihen. What's our shaila? I say, Ruvain, the basket of apples should be konam to you. So now, I plant the apples and it grows an orchard. What's the halacha for Ruvain? What's the halacha? Aser. They will say, no one's arguing on that. Why? Because halacha says it's clear that the new apples are an extension of the old ones. What happens if I exchange the basket of apples for a basket of oranges? So we'll say that's the machlokes case. Listen to the Rambam. Hilchos Nedarim, Perek Vav, Halacha Tes Vav. Ha'oser peirosav al chavero. Bein beneder, bein b'shvua, get ready for this. Hare gidulehen v'chilufeihen safek. See what I say? The Rambam is picking up the sugi. If you notice, by the way, the Rambam is doing two things over here. The first thing the Rambam will say is doing is he's saying, by the way, gidulehen and chilufeihen is a unit. There's no such thing as subdividing them. They're a unit. Now, why does he say safek? Because the Gemara doesn't come to a resolution, right? The Gemara leaves it totally open-ended. I will say what the Gemara makes it sound like is lechatchila. We say ultimately again, gidulehen is going to be aser, right? But b'di eved gidulehen will not. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Lechatchila chilufeihen will be aser, but b'di eved chilufeihen seems to take on a status of its own. That's what the Gemara sounds like. So Rambam says that's a safek. Therefore, lefichach. Chaveru aser begidulei peros elu b'chilufeihen. So we'll say salacha l'maisa. Therefore, watch this. Look what the Rambam says. So I go ahead. I take the basket of apples. I say, Ruvain, konam, this basket of apples to you. So now we'll say, what happens? The chatchila. What do we say to Ruvain? You cannot get any benefit from the apples if the apples are planted and then go into an apple orchard, or if they're exchanged for something else. That's the chatchila. However, the Rambam says, but if the apples were planted and they grew in an orchard and Reuven benefited from it, he's not in violation. Or the basket of apples was exchanged for a basket of oranges. If he got hana, he got hana. So we'll say fascinating. So the Rambam paskins chilufeyen v'gidulehen by Reuven is a suffix case. Any case, asavi lechatchila, we will tell Reuven you are aser b'gidulehen or b'chilufehen, but if you benefited from it, you are not in violation of a neder. Incredible. Good. So Rabbi say, so what about the previous case? Remember again, the way we started out the sugya, Rabbi say, was, I say to Reuven, konam my house unto you. So Rabbi say, what was the shaila? If I then go ahead and sell the house to someone else, does the status remain or not? So Rabbi say, the way the Gemara seemed to end off was saying that Allah a person has the ability to answer something that he currently owns, and that level of Isser will remain with the item even when he no longer owns it. So Rabbi says, interestingly enough, the Rambam says, same parak hey alocha hey hilchos nedarim. The Rambam says, Amar lo peros elu asurin alecha v'lo amar perosai. So I'll say, so remember again, this is a distinction we made before that the Gemara is not making it. The Gemara Mishnah made it. So if a person says these peros should be asur to you, afal pi shamachran o shemes v'nafal la'acher hare elu asurin alav. So Rabbi say, if you phrase the neder not in the possessive, but in the general, Reuven, these peros are asur to you. Konam, these peros to you. That level of isser remains upon the peros even when I no longer own the peros. Even if I sell them, right? Why? Sha'oser davar shu shalo achavero. Because if I ask for something that belongs to me, I ask for it upon my friend. Afal pi sheyatzim reshuso. Harehubi Isura Omed. Rabbi says, Rambam Paskins like the Gemara, namely, that when you create a level of Isra upon something that you currently own, that level of Isra remains with the object, even if the object leaves your ownership. Rabbi say, now the exception to this rule is, Elimkin Amar Nechasai Obesi. We learned this before. If the way you phrase the Neder, Rabbi say, is how? In the possessive, my house, my fruit, bless you, is usher to you, then Rabbi say, in that case, what? If I sell it or I die, it's no longer in my possession, then in that case, the Isser goes away with me. Incredible, say. So two very important pieces of halacha. So again, halacha, so the Rambam adopts the concept of Adam Oser Davar Birshuso, and ultimately again, Hareu B'Isura Omed. I can ask for something while it's under my ownership, and that level of Isser remains with the object, even when I no longer own it. And halacha l'maisa, if I go ahead and I ask for something upon my friend, l'chatchila, he remains asr begidulein bechilufein, but b'di'evet, if he got hana, there is no penalty for that. Incredible. So let's begin the Mishnah. Harini alayich cherim. So it's very interesting. I say to my friend, then I will say, up until now, we've been using the lashon of konam. Now we're transitioning a little bit, and we use lashon of cherim. I go over to her and I say, Reuven, I am cherem unto you. I am cherem unto you. And will say, if you never learn Nedarim, somebody says to you like, oh, thank you, right? I don't know, right? Okay, right. Good Shabbos to you too, right? Right. So now that's why it's good to learn, right? Hareni cherem alayich. So I am cherem unto you. So if you look at the Ran, second to last line, I will say from the bottom, second to last line, Harini alayich cherem, shetehei hana aso alav kecherem. Shal bedek habayis. So Rabbi say cherem means an item that is cherem is an item that belongs to the Beis Hamikdash. Now Rabbi say the Ran is pointing out over here what type of what is cherem. Cherem means something that's owned for bedek habayis. Bedek habayis means temple upkeep. Rabbi say if you remember again in the beginning of the sugya, we were talking about the concept. That halacha l'maisa that there are two different types of hegdish. Right? There's kidushas damim and kidushas haguf. There's monetary sanctity and there's physical sanctity, right? So, for example, when you're makdish a karban, behema zu ola, right? That animal has physical sanctity, as opposed to if you take a beam, right, a beam of wood, and you say that's hegdish, that has financial sanctity. So, we'll say, so the Ran just pointing out when a person says I'm cherem is a level of financial sanctity. So ultimately, again, so what am I saying? So what I'm saying to Reuven is Reuven, I am cherem unto you. What that statement actually means is I'm saying to Reuven, you are not allowed to get any hana'ah from me. That's what's happening over here. So what's the halacha? Hanoder aser. So I'm sorry, hamudar aser, the person who is the subject of the vow, Ruvain. Right? So if I say to Ruvain, I am cherem to you. Rabbi say, who has the isser over here? Who has the isser? Ruvain. In that Ruvain is not permitted to get any hana from me. Okay. Hariat alai cherem. If I say Ruvain, you are cherem unto me, then what? Hanoder aser. I, the person who's making the neder, I am aser. What does it mean I am aser? In other words, I am the one who cannot get any benefit from Ruvain. Harini alayich va'at alai. So let's say again, I say to Ruvain, all right, I am cherem unto you. You are cherem unto me. So what happens? Shnei masurim. They're both asur to get hana from one another. Now watch this. So here's what's fascinating. Now, once we get into a situation of what we'll call mutual isser, we're going to get into the interesting topic about what about items that are jointly owned. So therefore, the Mishnah says, "Ushnei mutar b'davar sha'olei bavel." And I will say they are both permitted to get benefit from things that were created for the benefit of those who came back from Bavel. So I will say we're going to see. If you look at the last ran on the daf, the ran says mutar b'davar sha'olei bavel shef kirim olei bavel l'chol Yisrael. I will say we're going to see something very interesting, that when the Jews from Bavel came back to Eretz Yisrael, what they did is on the way back between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, they created a number of wells. They did this first of all on their way back, right, with Ezra and Nehemiah, right, to God. But even more than that, remember, even when the Jews came back with Ezra and Nehemiah to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash, the majority of Jews did not come back. They did not come back. So there was still a whole population in Bavel. When they rebuilt the second Beis HaMikdash, so remember again, there's now once again a Chiyuv of Aliyah L'Regel, which means every Yom Tov you had Jews coming from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. So there was a wells all along the way. Those are called the wells of Olei Bavel. So we'll say in this case over here, Reuven and Shimon have just made, right, Reuven says to Shimon, Hareini alayich va'at alai. Right, Reuven, I am usher to get benefit from you, and you are usher to get benefit from me. So I will say, so in this case, the Mishnah just points out, they're permitted to get benefit from the wells between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. What's the reason for that, I will say? Because ultimately, again, those wells, the Ran says, Shef Kiram Olei Bavel L'chol Yisrael. The wells are essentially hefker for all of Klal Yisrael. Okay. Top of Memches. Va'asurim b'davar shel osa ha'ir. Oh, very interesting. And I will say, but watch this. Let's say Reuven and Shimon live in the same city. So we'll say, as residents of the city, there are certain things that the residents own jointly. Well, any part of the city that's owned jointly, neither Reuven nor Shimon have the ability to benefit from. Right? Why, Rabbi? Say why? Because remember again, since they own it jointly, if Reuven benefits from it, then what? He's benefiting from Shimon. If Shimon benefits from it, then he's benefiting from Reuven. So as if they live in the same city, any jointly owned city items, neither one can benefit from. So the Mishnah defines these terms. The Mishnah, ve'ezu davar sha'olei bavel. What's an example of something owned by Olei Bavel, or something belonging to Olei Bavel? Kigon harabayis. Incredible, I will say harabayis. So, by the way, that's another way of also saying is harabayis is owned by no one, and therefore it's the possession of everyone. So, I will say that's very interesting because remember again, even though the Gemara speaks about this, that technically speaking, the tribal line between Yehuda and Binyamin actually runs through the Beis HaMikdash. But interestingly enough, we hold that Yerushalayim lo nischalka l'shvatim. Yerushalayim does not belong to any one of the shvatim. It belongs to everyone. But specifically, Harabayis, Rabbosai, is not considered to be the property of anyone, right? Any one individual. So therefore, for example, even in this case, where Reuven and Shimon now are not permitted to benefit from each other, ultimately, again, they can still go to Harabayis. Va'azaros, same thing with the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. V'habar shebe'emtza haderech. And I will say, the pit ultimately, again, refers to the watering hole, right? The well, the cistern on the road up between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so we'll say, so these are examples of items that belong to Olei Bavel, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, both Reuven and Shimon are permitted to get benefit from it. Ve'ezuhu davar shel osair. So I will say, what's an example of something that belongs to the city? Kigon harachava, the town square. V'hamerchatz, the bathhouse. Beis HaKnesses, the shul. Teva, ultimately the aron. V'hasvarim, and ultimately books. So we'll say all of these svarim, books, literally again, these all refer to items that if you live in a city, It's jointly owned by the residents of the city. So the problem about Sair is anything joint, if you think about it, right? Reuven and Shimon live in the same city. So now what happens? Reuven said, I'm chayrim to you, you're chayrim to me. They can't benefit from each other. So we'll say, what's the problem? The problem is if they benefit from any of the jointly owned town's property, in every jointly owned town's property, we'll say, what happens? Reuven has a chilik and Shimon has a chilik, right? They both have a chilik in the same property. So what's the problem? If Reuven benefits from it, then what is he effectively doing? What is he doing? He's benefiting from Shimon. And if Shimon benefits from it, what is he benefiting from? From Reuven. So we'll say there's this interesting contradistinction between assets of a city or property of a city which may be jointly owned versus what we call property of Ole Bavel, which is free to be used by every member of Klal Yisrael, but what? Belongs to no one. So because it belongs to no one, both Reuven and Shimon are permitted to get benefit from it, as opposed to some of the assets of the city, the property of the city, which is jointly owned. If they have mutually restrictive Nedarim, neither of them are permitted to get benefit from it. So we'll say we'll stop over for today. We're stopping mid Mishnah, but let's stop over here. Let's hop in a few minutes on Mesilas Yesharim before our time runs out. Shkach, we'll say beautiful beginning to the week. Good. All right, I will say, so good morning. We are picking up today, Meretz Hashem. Today is Sunday, the 17th of Kislev. Baruch Hashem, I will say, 1 week from today, Erev Chanukah. Today, the 17th of Kislev, December 11th. Parakut Gimel. So I will say, we are continuing today, Meretz Hashem, in the 13th chapter of Pirkei. I'm sorry, I don't know why I keep saying Pirkei Avos. It's interesting. Okay, Mesilas Yesharim. So we'll say, here we go. Acha Inyanu. So I'll say, so remember again, we left off on Friday with Ramchal highlighting this idea or the challenge. What's the challenge? The challenge is we seem to have two competing values. On one hand, we have the Torah telling us that precious kedoshim tiyu is a powerful and important thing. Separating oneself from certain permissible pleasures, from certain permissible things, is an important and powerful tool for self-actualization and development. Yet, we have competing ma'amari Chazal that say abstaining unnecessarily from the world is actually sinful. It's actually sinful. So how do we reconcile the two? Right? How do we reconcile this? So here we go. So the Ramchal says, you're right. The truth is there are many nuanced distinctions here. There's a certain healthy form of precious that we've been commanded to observe. And I will say there are other forms of precious which ultimately are terribly detrimental that we have to try to avoid. What does Shalom Melech says? What does Shalom Melech say? Al tihi tzadik harbe. Wow, I will say, you never thought you'd hear those words, right? Shalom Melech says, don't be overly righteous. They both say, the Ramchal's understanding that what does it mean, don't be overly righteous? In other words, that there's a concept of precious, of restricting certain things to myself, even though they're mutter, but not going overboard. Right? That's what it means when it says, Anti Tzadik Harbe. Sometimes both say, sometimes a person could be trying to be too righteous. Now the truth is really what it means. It's not that I mean to be too righteous. It's ultimately, I'm finding righteousness or piety in the wrong ways. That's really what it means, Alti Tzadik Harbe. So look what he writes. So both say, so therefore, the Ramchal is acknowledging this. There's good precious and there's bad precious. So both say, by the way, he's already outlined this. What are the examples of bad precious? The example is a bad precious is toveling in the snow, right? Or in the ice, right? Or fasting excessively, right? So we'll say, so those are bad forms of precious. But there's good forms of precious. So he says, let's talk about good precious. V'nomar, so remember, we already learned in the first chapter of Mesilas Yesharim that everything in this world is a challenge. Right? Remember the lashon of the Ramchal? This world is one big milchama. It's one big war. It's one big battle. So we'll say the world is a battle. So we'll say, listen to this. Number one, you have to accept the fact life is, I will say, by the way, we spoke about this earlier in the Sefer. This is so important because often we approach life and we think, no, life is tranquil. That's right. Really, like the default status, the factory settings of life is tranquility. And so that's why when we encounter turbulence, we become so upset and disillusioned. Why are things so difficult? You're wrong. The mindset is wrong. The factory settings of life, Rabbi say, are milchama, challenge. That's the default. Rabbi say that's why, by the way, if you have a moment of tranquility or like a day of tranquility, hour of tranquility, mamish, you have to like roll it around your palate like a fine wine. Like that is a gift. Wow, like an hour, I will say an hour where like life is as it should be, so to speak, right? No, everyone's happy. There's no challenge. There's no problem. No one's sick. No one's suffering. If you have like an hour like that in your life, I will say, incredible. And you have to relish it because life is milchama. Life is milchama. So that's fact one. Fact two, says Ramchal, I will say, is we are fickle. In any given moment, I'm about like 1.3 seconds away from the commission of a terrible avera, right? That's where I'm holding it. I will say, by the way, it's not. Don't look at me like that. We're all like that. We're all think about this. So I will say, right? I am literally 1 second away from doing something terrible. I don't mean that I'm ready to do something terrible. I mean that I'm 1 second away from the ability to do something terrible. Right? That I know. So that's what he says over here. He says, "V'kirvas daito ala kol haros." So I know I'm literally 1 second away from committing an avera. So he says, "Yispar v'hechrich shekol ma sheyuchal ha'adam limalit min yanam ha'ela." Right? So now when I look at life through that lens, right? Number one, life is a constant milchama. Right? Number two, I'm always, in any given moment, a second away from committing an avera. So I will say, so now this constant struggle, I'm fragile and fickle, just always a few moments away from doing something terrible. Now I understand, wow, I really have to create boundaries for myself. I really have to create boundaries. He says, Roishi Aseu, Kadeshia Nishmar Yosem in Hara, Shebaragleim. So I say, so now I know I need to create boundaries. Why do I need to create boundaries? Because if I don't create boundaries, inevitably, there are always going to be some battles in the war of life that I lose. And I recognize how fickle and fragile I am. I need to get it together to ensure that halacha l'maisa, I don't go ahead and transgress. Here's the problem, and here's where the Ramchal really drills down to this. You know what the real challenge in life is? The real challenge in life is that any earthly pleasure, permitted pleasure that you engage in could so easily devolve into something prohibited and illicit. I will say, here it is. This is, Ramchal is describing, you want to know what is at the core of the challenge of the human condition? Number one, I'm constantly in battle mode. That's number one. Number two, I'm only like a second or two away from committing an avera. Number three is that everything I do in life, even the mutter things, could so easily devolve into sinful behavior. I will say he's going to outline this. This is incredible. He says, for example, derech mashal, hamaychal v'amishta, eating and drinking. I will say, anything wrong with eating and drinking? Anything wrong with it? No. Absolute necessity. I will say, by the way, how do you know there's nothing wrong with it? Because Chazal attached brachas to it. Right? You only attach brachas to things that are good. I will say the same way that I make a bracha before I shake my lulav and esrog. I make a bracha before I eat different kinds of brachas. But the idea is that the act of eating itself is something that can be so sacred. I'm fueling my body. Why does a Jew eat? Don't say because there's food on the table, right? Why does a Jew eat? A Jew eats because we'll say, I'm fueling myself for dynamic life activity. I want to do stuff. I want to accomplish some. Well, again, if you want to accomplish something, there's got to be gas in the tank, right? If I'm running on empty, I can't do anything. I eat because I have things to accomplish in life. That's why Chazal put a bracha before you eat, because it's a sacred act. So look what he writes. So again, as long as I'm eating kosher food, making brachas beforehand, totally mutter, maybe even a mitzvah. Amnam, milia keres, moshech achar of prikas. I will say, what's the problem? I will say, when do people tend to get themselves in the most trouble? When the belly is full. Right? When you feel full and satiated, right? I will say that's often when gaiva kicks in. That's when self-centeredness kicks in. Right? Hungry people are very humble. Satiated people, tend to get a little bit carried away with themselves. Umishte yayin, we'll say a person drinks wine. We know again, we'll say, so again, is there anything wrong with drinking wine? Only if it has a screw top, right? Right? But aside from that, right? In other words, the act of drinking wine, I will say, again, every davar shebekdusha, bris milah has wine, a chasana has wine, Levias used to have wine, right? I will say, so again, wine is associated with every single life ritual and rite. Yeah, I will say, we know too much wine, forget about it. Worst taveris. Moshe Acharav has nus ushnar minei roim. Al kol shekain shebiyos. So what do you? Isn't this incredible? So now eating meat. He's not saying meat. Eating food and drinking wine is mutter. It's mutter, right? Not only that, if done in the right way, it's a mitzvah. You know, say, just what does it take? One too many pieces of meat, and I'm so satiated that I become a Baal Gaiva. One too many glasses of wine, and I could commit the worst. So I say, this is the challenge. You see, we always think that successful living, okay, as long as I avoid the Averis, I'm okay. But says Ruchal, it's not true. It's not true. Even if you're successful in avoiding the Averis, the challenge in life, the constant milchama, is that even the things that are mutter, have with them the possibility to devolve into the most terrible sinful behavior. He goes on and he says, Kol shekain, shebiosa adam margil atzmo l'spa ma'achil u'shtia. When a person habituates himself to become very sated with eating and drinking, hine pam achas yechsar lo regilus. So let's listen to this. This is incredible. Let's say a person accustoms himself to a certain quality of life, right? I only eat food of a certain level, drink wine of a certain level. So what happens? If one time he doesn't have the wine he wants, he doesn't have the food that he wants, yichav lo v'yargish ma'od. It hurts. Omipnei zeh nimtzu machnis atzmo betokav amol aschora v'yigia sakinyon l'chishtiya shulchano aruch al kirtzono. See, I will say what happens, and I will say this is an incredible thing. See, if you accustom yourself to a certain lifestyle, it's not just by meat and wine. If you need to live in a certain kind of house, and you need to drive a certain kind of car, and you need to go to a certain kind of Pesach program, and you need to go ahead and go on a certain kind of vacation. So what happens now? I've put my standard of living up here. That's great, as long as you're making the money. As long as you're making the money, better, no problem. Well, say what happens? What happens now? I didn't have such a good year. I'm not making the money, but I've established my lifestyle up here. So what happens? You know what happens? No one brings their lifestyle back down. Instead, what happens? Now I'm going to work harder. I'm going to keep working harder. The Rebbe says, so what happens? וממשם על השבוס, וכל שאר החתם הבאים אחר זה, ומסר עצמו מן העבודה, מן התורה, מן התפילה. מה שהיה נפטר מכל זה, לו מתחילה סלו מה שסבוא say, what happens? What happens now when I start working harder? And I will say, why am I working harder? Why am I working harder? I'm working harder to support a grand lifestyle that's not really all that necessary. But now because that's become my baseline, so I have to support. I will say, what's the difference between luxuries and necessities? The difference is a day. One day is the difference, meaning today's luxuries become tomorrow's necessities. That's how life works. So now what happens? When the parnasa was going great, no problem. But now the parnasa is not so great. But now I have to support my lifestyle. So what happens? So Ramchal starts from the extreme. He says, well, now what's going to end up happening is, now, if I have to cheat to get ahead, I'll cheat to get ahead. I have to go ahead and steal, I'll steal. We'll say, it's not even, you don't have to get to that level. What's the other? We'll say, a person's going to end up working more and more. And we'll say, what does more work come at the expense of? What does come at the expense of? My ruchnius. So now suddenly what's ended up happening is, because I developed for myself a very grand appetite for the material pleasures of this world, suddenly again I've set my lifestyle at here. So now when my income doesn't match my lifestyle, I have to work harder. Even if I'm going to be honest. I have to work harder, and all of that hard work comes at the expense of my ruchnius. Meanwhile, had I not set my appetites here, had I not set my appetites up here, but I would set my appetites maybe just a little bit more modestly. Again, enjoy the nice things in life, but set the appetite a little bit more modestly. Perhaps then, when my income situation changed, I wouldn't have had to give up all of my ruchnius to support my grand lifestyle. I will say, what a musr. I want to just point out to you, This is the great challenge of our dar. Because I will say there is a sense of unprecedented wealth within Klal Yisrael, and what we do, whether we recognize it or not, is we create a standard of living that is beautiful, that is wonderful. And it's fantastic as long as you can support it. You know when it becomes a problem? You know when it becomes a problem? When you can't support it. And there's an expectation that you're going to support it. And I will say, the expectations today on a frum family, the expectations are absolutely overwhelming, right? It used to be that when your children got married, at least maybe you could take a vacation, right? Now I will say again, when your children get married, it's a whole new expectation of support. A whole new, now again, it's beautiful if you could do it. It's beautiful if you could do it. And I will say, but the expectations we've created on all different levels. I made a joke about the Pesach program. And I will say, do you know that you could solve Klal Yisrael's poverty problem if people stopped going to Pesach programs for 10 years? I know I put up 5, right? Start with 5 years. 5 years. Take all of that money. Create a central tzedakah fund. A central tzedakah fund. Whatever you were going to spend on Pesach, just put it in the tzedakah fund. And I'm not saying people should go, but I'm just saying, let's say, but like the grandness and the pressure, by the way, the pressure that people feel to go away by Pesach. I literally had a conversation with someone who came to me, says, I'm struggling. I said to him, why are you struggling? I'm so sorry to hear that. I said, can I ask you, what do you need? What do you need the money for? Get ready. Orlando. I said, is that some like Orlando, like Bloom, like the actor? Who's Orlando? Who's Orlando? No, Pesach. He said, but you don't understand. If I don't go, like my Shalom Bayis is gone. If I don't go, my kids are like, what? By the way, there is a concept like tzedakah for things like that. But I will say, but just understand that's the challenge we're living with today. That's the challenge we're living with, is we create an expectation for ourselves, the neighbor, and I will say, the Ramchal says, wouldn't life be so much better if we just create a lower expectation from the beginning? If the expectation is lower from the beginning, then maybe, again, when times become tough, which inevitably they do, perhaps you don't feel simach. So I have to stop over here. I know we're a little bit behind. Stop here. Let's say, shkoyach. Again, beginning of an incredible week. And we'll pick up with this tomorrow. We'll spend a little bit more time in that. Just in Messiah's charm. Shkoyach.
On for 2.